There are some things that I wish I had known when I started reading the classics, so today I am going to discuss that topic. First of all, let's discuss abridged versions and full versions of a novel. So this is The Count of Monte Cristo, and I bought this edition before I knew that editors made cuts in books. I had no idea. So I purchased this, but when I found out that certain chapters were missing, I bought myself the Penguin Classics edition. So you should know that for the bigger books, they tend to make abridged versions. Usually it gets mentioned on the back of the book, the front of the book, or on the inside. In this case, it is mentioned on one of the first pages. I prefer reading the full version as the author has written the novel, but I can imagine that it is a bit more approachable for some people to go for an abridged version. My second point, I didn't know there were literary movements. And by this I mean modernism, ancient classics, realism, naturalism, and so on. The ancient classics are, for example, Homer's work, Virgil, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and so on. Very, very old texts, Beowulf. Okay, I need to hold my hair a bit because it's so warm. So we have realism like Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, and modernism like Marcel Proust, Virginia Woolf, and so on. And it is good to know that they exist, that they are out there. And I also discovered that I dislike modernism and that realism is my favorite literary movement. So it is really handy to know those movements and to kind of figure out which ones are your favorites so you can pick your books more thoughtfully. My next point, translations. So there are a lot of differences between different translations. You can find a lot of information online about translations and which one is the best one. I think it's more or less subjective. And I must admit, and I have a very unpopular opinion about this, I never encountered a book that I've read and thought that was such a bad translation, in a way that it influenced my enjoyment. And of course, when you compare two books, when you put two different translations next to one another, there will be a lot of differences. And I don't really tend to research much about different translations, except when it concerns very old texts like the Divine Comedy and so on, because they're a bit harder to read. And for example, for the Iliad and the Odyssey, I really did my research about which translation to get because I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to get into the story or the poem. And I decided to go with a very approachable translation, and I went with Robert Fagles. But in general, I really don't care that much about the translator. Maybe one day I will read a book where I think, what a bad translation, but up until now, it didn't happen yet. Of course, we do not have this problem when we are reading English or American authors or authors who wrote in English as their first language. But when you want to read a French novel or a Russian novel, for example, translations can really make a huge difference. My next point, when I started reading classics, I realized how fast I was reading. I was usually reading fantasy novels and I was going fast. And I really needed to take a step back and go slower to really understand the story because the classics are a bit more complex and the language is older and more archaic, so it was really important to read slower. Do not be discouraged when you notice that you are reading much slower because it's completely normal and it will also improve over time. My next point is research. I've noticed that it can be handy for some books to know a little background information before you get started. This is also why I make videos about how to read a book, how to get started with a certain author, because it can make such a huge difference when you know the background information of the time period of the author and so on. Next, the most famous books like Wuthering Heights, Pride and Prejudice, and so on, are often very difficult ones for beginners. So I've also made the mistake of starting out with, for example, Wuthering Heights. That was one of my first classics that I ever read, just on my own, not in school. And I was so confused. I found it so difficult. And when I look back now, I know that that wasn't the best choice, but you know, what do? You pick the most famous classics first, right? So if you're looking for some easier classics to start with, go ahead and look on my channel, because I have made several videos on that topic, and I have a video where I recommend classic novels for beginners. My next point, you should know about the website called Gutenberg. I will put the text on the screen, but here you can find all the classics that your heart desires for free. You can download it as a Kindle version or an EPUB or a PDF, whatever you want. Now, I would especially recommend this website if you are reading an author who has written his or her book in original English, because the translations on that website aren't really that good. They're often very old. And so if you're looking for the most accessible or the best translation of a novel, you should go for the Penguin Classics editions or the Oxford World's Classics editions. I've had the best experience with those publishers concerning translations. Also, Everyman's Library is very good. I think that is my favorite publishing house. I love their hardcovers. I love the feel, the pages. Oh my gosh, the pages. They feel so good, and those are just quality books, and I prefer Everyman's Library above every other publisher. My next point is Snobbism. You will encounter some very rude people, especially within the classic literature movement. And I just want to say, don't worry about them. You do you read the books that you love to read. If you dislike a book, it is not because you didn't read it well or because you didn't get it. There is no shame in loving a certain genre or a certain book. For some readers, you just can never read the right books, the perfect books. It is exhausting, and you should know that they are out there, especially in the classics movement. But try not to let them get you. Next, book introductions and spoilers. So, let's say we want to start reading The Count of Monte Cristo. What do? Indeed, you start at the very beginning. You turn the first page and you have the contents. The next page is chronology, which we skip. Then we have the introduction. You think you should start reading the introduction, but I want to say, do not do that. I started reading classics and I started with the introduction, and I always got spoilers. My gosh, never start with the introduction. Save it for the moment you have finished that novel and then return to the introduction, because the author of the introduction will spoil the book for you with pleasure. Make sure to skip it, but return to it. Make sure that you remember to return to it, because the introductions are full, packed of information, lovely things to know about the author, about the work itself. So it's absolutely worth reading. I always enjoy them, especially in the Penguin Classics. These are really, really good. But yeah, don't read them before you read the book. Next, when you come across bracket, lit, bracket, I will put it on the screen. That means that the author has quoted some other author or another work. Next, if you are struggling with reading a certain novel and you really want to get through it, you can use websites that analyze and summarize novels. So when you finish chapter 1, you can read the summary and the analysis online of that chapter. And famous websites are called Lit Charts and Spark Notes. I use Lit Charts when I want to read Shakespeare, because I cannot read the original Shakespeare. That is too hard for me. So on that website, you have on the left the original Shakespeare, and then on the right you have the modern translation, and you can go back and forth, and it is wonderful. My next point is reading groups. It can be fun to buddy read a certain novel with a friend or someone you met online. If you're reading a novel that's more difficult or a bigger one that you're struggling to get through, it can be really motivating to read it together with someone. My next point is probably a little controversial, but I don't see any problem in watching a movie adaptation before reading the actual book. I will always try to read the book first, but in some cases I was very happy that I saw the movie before reading the book. For example, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I was so glad that I saw that movie and that I know it by heart before I read the book, because while I was reading Pride and Prejudice, I was happy to already know all the character names. There are so many characters. I think it's a confusing book, and yeah, in cases like that, I think it is just handy to have seen the movie before you dive into the novel. So let's imagine that you are currently reading Wuthering Heights and you are really struggling and you are about to give up on it. I would highly recommend to watch an adaptation, a TV show, a movie, so that you can get the basic feel, the basic storyline, the basic characters, and then return to that novel, and it can make a huge difference. Next, you should know that there are books out there, editions of certain novels that also have an analysis within that book. For example, the Norton Critical editions, they have the book and then a section where someone analyzes the book. I didn't know that when I started out, and I thought that you should know. And the final advice that I want to give you is to check the font size, okay? Because there can be a lot of difference between different publishing houses and different editions. I once bought an edition online secondhand of War and Peace. It was so tiny that I resold it again because War and Peace is such a big book, and I just didn't want to spend all of those months reading that tiny font. So if you can, check out the font size. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.